The film sets a grim tone in a rural Texas landscape. A ruthless land developer and mafia boss named Blaine Richterfield was dead set on seizing a piece of farmland. When the rightful owner, a farmer, stood his ground and outright refused to sell his property, Richterfield responded with an act of pure, callous brutality. He cruelly murdered the man in cold blood. The farmer's young son, Diego, could only look on from a distance, a white-hot fury bubbling beneath the surface as he watched his father's life extinguished. Moments later, Diego was spotted by one of Richterfield's men. This man, however, was Richterfield's personal driver, a man named Silas. Rather than hauling the boy in, Silas quietly told Diego to make himself scarce, warning him that if Richterfield found him, he would meet the same fate as his parents. Diego took the warning to heart. He returned to his home only later that afternoon and was met with a devastating reality. Richterfield's crew had also savagely murdered his mother. It wasn't long before Silas showed up, clearly beside himself with guilt. He offered a sincere apology for the unspeakable actions of his boss. Silas then made a life-altering promise. He would take Diego away and raise him as his own son, but he couldn't do it there. He planned to smuggle Diego to his native China to live with his father, Bingwen, and his youngest daughter, Xin Yi. With nowhere else to turn and his entire life turned upside down, Diego accepted Silas's offer and was whisked away by ship that very day. After a grueling journey, Diego arrived in China and was taken under the wing of Bingwen, who was not only just Silas's father, but a renowned martial arts master too. Bingwen was already teaching his granddaughter, Xin Yi, the ways of the fist and foot, and soon began training Diego as well. Years flew by like a bullet. Diego and Xin Yi were now adults, but the passage of time hadn't diminished the past. One evening, Diego was caught in a fever pitch of rage, relentlessly pounding a punching bag as the vivid memory of his parents' murder came roaring back. Bingwen intervened, attempting to calm him down, arguing that revenge was a poisonous path and that pursuing Richterfield would be futile. In a moment of truth, Bingwen revealed the real situation. Silas was only pretending to be Richterfield's loyal driver. His true motive was to avenge the death of his own eldest daughter, who had been kidnapped, raped, and murdered by Richterfield. However, Silas had become hopelessly ensnared in the criminal's organization. This was the real reason Silas had saved Diego. He was terrified that the boy would end up just as trapped and consumed as he was. Hearing that his parents were not the only victims of the monster, Richterfield only poured gasoline on Diego's fire, further cementing his resolve for vengeance. With his renewed resolve and without wasting a moment, Diego made his move. Just before dawn, he slipped out like a shadow without a word to Bingwen and booked passage on a ship bound for the States, determined to get back to America and launch his vendetta against Richterfield. The journey was rough. He ended up in a tangle with two thugs aboard the vessel, and despite easily putting the hurt on them, his actions attracted the attention of the ship's security. Deemed a rioter, he was forcibly ejected from the ship the moment it made a port call in Mexico, still miles away from his intended destination in the U.S. Back in Texas, Blaine Richterfield was having a sit-down with his right-hand man. His organization had diversified far beyond simple land grabbing. Richterfield was now a full-blown criminal mastermind, dealing in drug trafficking and, most disturbingly, human trafficking. He was instructing his lieutenant to keep a tight leash on the women he had kidnapped, as buyers were expected to arrive soon to purchase them. Meanwhile, stranded in Mexico, Diego took a breather at a nearby bar. He was approached by a bald man named William, who was casually playing pool. Before they could exchange more than a few words, two intimidating figures confronted William, demanding he accompany them. William gave them the cold shoulder, and the confrontation immediately escalated into a full-scale brawl outside the bar.
Come on, let's go!
Remember, we need him alive.
You look better now.
Diego was initially content to stay on the sidelines, but when the aggressors dropped Richterfield's name, Diego's ears perked up. He instantly recognized them as agents of the man who had ruined his life. He didn't hesitate to jump into the fray, lending his expertise to William.
I lied, you still ugly as shit.
After they had successfully taken the goons out of commission, William urged Diego to make a quick exit before law enforcement showed up. They drove to a nearby beach to catch their breath. William extended his gratitude for the assist, and noticing Diego was an unfamiliar face, asked where he was from. Diego told him he was raised in China and was headed for Texas. That's when Diego spotted the distinctive corporate logo of Richterfield's company emblazoned on William's car. Straight away, he asked William about the connection. William confessed that he was a former associate, explaining that he used to work for Richterfield as a drug runner. However, after Richterfield ruthlessly murdered his younger brother, William cut his losses, stole the car as his own form of twisted severance pay, and had been on the run ever since. Hearing that William shared a tragic history with the same ruthless villain, Diego immediately offered a sincere apology for his initial suspicion. Diego laid his cards on the table, revealing the cold, hard truth. He was in Texas to hunt down Blaine Richterfield for the brutal, unforgivable murder of his parents. He proposed an alliance, hoping William would join forces to seek their collective revenge. William, having his own history with a corrupt mob boss, didn't need convincing. He instantly accepted Diego's offer. Back at the compound, the two goons who had been laid out by Diego and William finally reported back to Richterfield, dragging a newly kidnapped woman with them. They stammered out an excuse, blaming the entire fiasco on William and admitting they failed to recapture the traitor. Richterfield, livid at the failure, but momentarily distracted by his business, ordered the goons to track down and catch William at any cost. Following the report, he instructed Silas to take the newly captured woman and secure her in another room. Hours later, William and Diego were grabbing a meal when William asked for the full story. Diego explained the simple, infuriating motive behind the killings. His father had simply refused to sell his land to the greedy developer. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted when they spotted a woman attempting to hotwire William's car. Both men immediately confronted her. As William moved to stop her escape, the woman lashed out, throwing a knife at his shoulder. Fortunately, Diego's martial arts reflexes allowed him to subdue the attacker quickly. When Diego demanded to know why the woman was trying to steal the vehicle, the woman, who introduced herself as Blanca, pointed to the Richterfield logo on the side of the car. She explained that she despised Richterfield because she was a survivor of his vile human trafficking ring. She had managed to escape, but several of her friends were still captive. Hearing her story, Diego told her that he and William were on a mission to bring Richterfield down, and if she wanted to save her friends and get even, she could join their team. Blanca, a woman with nothing to lose and a sharp eye for vengeance, accepted the partnership without hesitation. On the other hand, as the day ended, the villain was on the move. Richterfield gathered Silas and two other men, announcing they were going to a nearby village to acquire a new farm. Silas, clearly distressed by the prospect of witnessing another violent land seizure, pleaded with Richterfield to reconsider, but the mob boss was set in his ways and refused to back down from the forced transaction. Diego and his newly formed crew, William and Blanca, had tracked their way to a vast tract of land owned by Blaine Richterfield. Blanca pointed out that this wasn't land Richterfield had legitimately purchased. He had muscled it away from local farmers and was intending to use it as the site for a new factory. Diego, ever the man with a one-track mind, simply stated that Richterfield's building plans would be permanently interrupted by his own imminent demise. They settled down and built a campfire to see out the night. Just a moment later, their encampment was interrupted by an armed man named James, who immediately pointed his gun at them. When Diego asked his intentions, James explained he was simply patrolling the perimeter, enforcing Richterfield's strict no trespassing rule. Quick as ever, Bianca used her knife to incapacitate the armed man. Taking advantage of a moment of distraction, Diego and William swiftly disarmed and tied him up. Diego pressed him, wanting to know why a man would choose to work for a monster like Richterfield. James explained his dark truth. Richterfield was holding his family hostage, threatening to kill them if he stepped out of line. He stressed that he didn't want to hurt anyone, but he felt he had no choice in the matter, as his family's life was paramount. Diego recognized that James was a reluctant victim, not a true villain, and he instructed Blanca to immediately untie him. He extended an invitation to James to join their squad, but James politely refused, too afraid of what Richterfield would do to his loved ones. He did, however, promise to keep his mouth shut about their presence and gave them his blessing for their mission. The following day, Diego and his companions showed up unannounced at Silas's home. Silas was utterly floored to see Diego, believing him to be safe in China with his father, Bingwen, and Xin Yi. Diego apologized for leaving without permission, explaining that he couldn't wait any longer to avenge his parents and had found two allies who were on the same wavelength. Diego then cut straight to the chase, demanding that Silas give up the location of Richterfield's main compound. Silas, afraid for Diego's life, initially refused to cooperate, but Diego, knowing where to hit him hardest, reminded Silas about his deceased eldest daughter and the heinous acts Richterfield had committed. The mention of his daughter's tragic fate shattered Silas's defenses. Overcome with emotion and his own simmering rage, Silas finally agreed to stop driving for the villain and officially joined Diego's team. Under the cloak of darkness, Diego and his now complete team, Silas, Blanca, and William, began their final preparations. They spent the evening gathering every available weapon and meticulously hammering out an attack strategy, guided by Silas's intimate knowledge of Richterfield's compound. Feeling fully prepared for the imminent raid, they set off. Upon arrival, they moved like ghosts in the machine, silently taking out every guard they encountered on the ground floor. Their initial objective was a success. They located the captive women and immediately started the release process. Blanca, focused on getting the survivors out, told Diego to oversee the evacuation while she handled a critical tactical task, eliminating Richterfield's right-hand man, who was situated on the top floor. Blanca ascended to the top and, with her expertise, swiftly engaged and killed the lieutenant. She then rejoined Diego and the others. Diego instructed Blanca to prioritize the safety of all the women, especially her friends, while he, William, and Silas would push deeper inside to confront Richterfield himself. Before she left, Blanca gave Diego a small, sharp hairpin, a quick thinking gesture, just in case he found himself in a bind. Unfortunately, the momentum was short-lived. No sooner had Blanca and the rescued women left the premises than Diego and the others were ambushed and surrounded by a vast, hidden deployment of Richterfield's men. Completely outgunned, they had no choice but to throw in the towel. A guard then called the boss, informing Richterfield of the capture, and the mobster commanded them to keep the trio alive. He wanted to savor the pleasure of torturing them personally. Before facing the heroes, Richterfield prepared his ultimate psychological weapon. He had become suspicious of Silas's behavior, and a few days prior had sent men to China to kidnap Bingwen and Xin Yi. Richterfield took photos of his new captives. Meanwhile, Diego, William, and Silas were already being relentlessly beaten by the guards. But even through the pain, Diego was one step ahead, secretly using the hairpin Blanca had given him to work on the restraints locking his hands. When Richterfield finally arrived, he went straight for the emotional jugular, brandishing the photo and threatening to execute Silas's entire family. Silas, heartbroken, begged Richterfield to take his life instead, but Richterfield, savoring the moment, refused, announcing his plan to wipe out the whole family line. Just as the execution seemed imminent, a sudden gunshot ripped through the air, taking down one of the guards. The newcomer was James, the conflicted security guard they had spared earlier, who had decided to risk everything to save them. As Richterfield and his remaining men scattered to the upper floor, one guard quickly turned his weapon on James. But Diego, now free of his handcuffs thanks to Blanca's hairpin, immediately drew a recovered sidearm and took the man down. Diego, Silas, William, and James wasted no time, rushing inside to engage the rest of Richterfield's guards. The fight was instantly ratcheted up when Blanca, having safely seen the kidnapped women to freedom, suddenly reappeared to lend her lethal, knife-throwing skills to the fray, swiftly dropping two more of the enemy guards. With the battle in full swing, Diego and Silas decided to go for the head of the snake, heading for Richterfield's inner office, while Blanca, James, and William created a vital distraction and held the line against the remaining forces. Upon reaching Richterfield's lavish office, Diego and Silas were brought to a sudden, terrifying halt. The mob boss was there, a gun leveled at the heads of the kidnapped Bingwen and Xin Yi. Richterfield commanded them to drop their weapons, and in a twisted act of vengeance, he suddenly fired, hitting Silas. Seeing his chance, Diego immediately lunged for Richterfield. However, the long night of fighting, the prior beating, and the adrenaline dump left Diego momentarily compromised, and the mob boss quickly got the better of him. Meanwhile, downstairs, James, Blanca, and William finally managed to eliminate the last three guards, securing the area before racing upstairs to back up Diego. Mid-brawl, Richterfield, slightly winded but arrogant, demanded to know who this young man was and why he was so obsessively determined to see him dead. Diego, fueled by years of suppressed pain, shouted out the names of his parents, killed at Richterfield's command right before his young eyes. The names rang a bell with the mob boss, who suddenly realized the chilling truth. Diego was the child Silas had been ordered to kill all those years ago. The knowledge added a layer of personal satisfaction to the final, no-holds-barred fight that continued between the two sworn enemies. Despite his superior training, Diego found himself momentarily on the back foot against the desperate fury of Richterfield. But the battle was far from a two-man affair. Xin Yi, having managed to secretly slip her bonds, immediately joined the fray, lending her own martial arts prowess to aid Diego. In a shocking display of brute strength, Richterfield somehow held his own against the combined assault of the two expert fighters. Then, the tides truly turned. Silas, bleeding profusely from the gunshot wound but still alive, mustered his last ounce of strength and fired his weapon, critically wounding Richterfield. Diego seized the advantage, raining down a barrage of brutal blows, determined to extract the full measure of vengeance for his deceased parents. Just as Diego was about to deliver the fatal strike, James, Blanca, and William burst into the room. James pleaded with Diego to stop, urging him to take Richterfield alive so the law could put him away for good. Richterfield merely sneered and laughed at the notion of justice, making a desperate lunge for a hidden firearm. Before he could raise it, Diego, utterly fed up with the mob boss's endless reign of terror, ignored the plea for restraint and delivered the final, decisive blow, ending Richterfield's life and the long chapter of vengeance. In the ensuing quiet, the relief was immediately overshadowed by tragedy. Silas, the conflicted driver who had sacrificed everything for his family and for Diego, succumbed to his wounds and breathed his last. With the villain vanquished and the compound secure, Diego made sure to gather all the illegally seized land documents from Richterfield's safe, resolving to ensure they were returned to their rightful owners. The next day, the surviving crew, Diego, Blanca, William, and James, gathered. Having faced death together and succeeded, they reached a unanimous decision. They would not stop here. They agreed to form a permanent team, dedicating themselves to hunting down criminals and serving justice where the law failed. In a spontaneous moment of relief and new beginnings, Blanca, who had clearly been swept away by Diego's courage and dedication, closed the distance between them and planted a heartfelt kiss on the group's leader.